Welcome to the Culture and Leadership Connections podcast. If your job involves working with or influencing people's behavior, this podcast offers invaluable insights into what makes people tick. Through personal interviews that are thoughtful and surprising, we explore the full range of the roots to people smarts that can help you make or break your own career. My name is Marie Gervais, and with a PhD in culture and learning in the workplace and my own cultural journey, I bring the mysteries of human beings at work around the world to you. Through conversations with very diverse people, examining the groups they were born into and the ones they chose to belong to, my podcast takes a deep dive into why people do what they do and how they belong. Hone your skills to manage others and to be a better human being at work with the Culture and Leadership Connections podcast. And now for today's episode. Hello, Culture and Leadership Connections podcast listeners. Today I have a wonderful guest for you, a Canadian guest with much expertise whose name is Carolyn Stern. She's the president and CEO of EI Experience, which is an executive leadership development and emotional intelligence training firm, a topic that's dear to my heart. Carolyn is the author of The Emotionally Strong Leader, an inside-out journey to transformational leadership. In addition, she is a certified emotional intelligence and leadership development expert, a professional speaker, and a university professor whose courses and modules have been adopted by top universities in North America. She has provided a comprehensive training program to business leaders across the continent in highly regarded corporations, encompassing industries such as technology, finance, healthcare, and many others. She lives in Vancouver, Canada, with her dog Cosmo and cat Velvet, who may contribute to our interview. Welcome, Carolyn.
Thanks, Marie, for having me. And just as we were coming on, the phone rings.
I didn't hear it, so we're good to go. So that was the professional bio, but tell the audience a little bit more about who you are so they can get to know you personally.
Well, I was a very emotional, sensitive child growing up, and my family tried to do whatever it took to hide things from me, and them actively protecting me from gloomy emotions like hurt and disappointment really made me doubt my capabilities to handle emotional issues. And to be honest, I desperately wanted to be included and hated not knowing important family matters. So being left on those emotional sidelines and being brushed off as overly emotional just led me to a lot of doubt on how I handled things emotionally, my responses when hard realities hit. So I think becoming an emotional intelligence expert has become a necessity for me because my emotions really did run amok of my life. And it was only then when I became bigger and stronger than my emotions and not let them take the driver's seat of me, did my life turn around.
Did you have brothers and sisters?
I had a sister, yes. And I was definitely the more emotional one. And then plus I was kind of coupled with constant feelings of anxiety, right? Not knowing what was around the corner, which really turned my worries into emotional outbursts and panic attacks and meltdowns. And ultimately and eventually emotional dependence on my mother specifically, which is probably the reason why I have been so passionate about emotional intelligence, because when I did my own emotional intelligence assessment, when I got certified, I realized how low my independence was. And Marie, I thought I was a very independent woman, right? I'm financially independent. I'm not married. I travel by myself, but I realized I cared too much about what people think and needed too much emotional approval and validation because my mother kind of was that classical helicopter parent and kind of did everything for me. And although my mother still loves and cares for me today, like any other mother, I am really grateful for everything she sacrificed because it was her working 3 jobs to give me the education I have today, which is now one of the reasons why we live together now. She lives with me under the same roof since COVID. And to me, it's payback time because she really did take care of me as a child and as an adult. And I had to learn to become emotionally independent from her and not become codependent on her.
Very interesting. Have you always lived in Vancouver?
No, Vancouver and Calgary. Even I did a stint in London, Ontario, and then I actually went to the University of Copenhagen. So I was in Denmark for one of my degrees as well.
Great. I'm going to ask you more about those things later. But let's start maybe with your childhood. Do you have a couple of incidents from your childhood that you were significant for you? They can be positive, negative, or anything in between, but they stand out in your memory.
Like I said, in general, I think kind of like being pushed on the sidelines and coddled, as my mother kind of coddled me as the helicopter parent, kind of reinforced for me this learned habit of not trusting my own judgments.
I would like something specific, though. Like, for example, I'm thinking about a memory that you might have. My earliest memory is lying on my back, looking at the snowflakes falling on my face. I think I was 2 years old on a sled. So it's not like it was positive or negative, but it is a memory. But I remember things from my childhood that affected the way I am now. Right. So there are specific incidents about when I was growing up in elementary school and as an adolescent that I can call to mind. So that's really what I'm looking for.
One example would be whenever my mother would leave the house, whether it was on a date with my father or just out for work, I'd always feel like I'd have to wear her bathrobe and I'd have her smell around me because I was worried she wouldn't come back. And again, kind of going back to the story of being coddled, I was worried of abandonment and scared that, she wouldn't come back and constantly needing validation and approval and reassurance. Really, that's probably one memory that I remember of that.
Mm-hmm. What about when you were a teenager or a young adult? What's a memory that stands out for you that you think helped form your character?
I think as a young adult, being a high school teacher, I talk about it in my book, having 2 students in my class that kind of got into a fist fight the first day of class and thinking, what am I going to do? How are these kids going to learn from me, let alone listen to me? And it was at that moment that I kind of gave them the most critical roles in the class. I made them both VPs of operations and VP. It was a entrepreneurship class, and I made the other one VP of human resources. And my teacher friends thought I was crazy because why was I giving these troubled kids very important roles? But I thought to myself, I wonder how they must be feeling to kind of, again, be brushed off on the sidelines. And so I wanted to give them a chance. And that opportunity made me feel that when I connected on an emotional level with these kids, things changed for them. So the one student 20 years later, when I was writing the book, I reached out to her on Facebook. I couldn't find the other student, but I did find the one. And she tells me that changed her life. And it did change mine because not only did she go from fist fights, but she ended up being first in class in the school. She ended up being the most improved student in all of the high school. And it just was really my start of my journey with emotional intelligence, that when you can connect with people on an emotional level, great things can happen for you and the other people.
Oh, that's a beautiful story. And life-changing for both of you, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I love that you're the VP of Human Resources now, that it gives you a new role and responsibility. I also was a teacher for 17 years, and I found that the kids that were the most troublesome often were the ones that could rise to leadership the best once you gave them the opportunity.
Yeah. And I think a lot of times having taught at the university for 25 years and then taught in high school for 5, and, 2 of my degrees are in education, I think learning, there's emotions involved with learning, right? It can be a scary proposition because you're going from the comfortable of what you do know to what you don't know, the uncomfortable. Our job as teachers, as you know, Marie, is to push people from their comfort zone into their learning zone, but to not push them to the point that it becomes a panic zone and it becomes an uncomfortable situation that becomes a negative situation. So I want to get them a little uncomfortable, but I don't want to put them to the point of panic that it becomes a whole negative experience and then they don't appreciate the learning at all.
Mm-hmm. So when you think about the groups that you were born into, you're born into a country, you're born into an area, into a city, a race, a social class, maybe there's a religious influence in there. Those groups that you were born into that you didn't have any say over, but you just happened to be born there, what would you say has influenced you and helped to form your sense of leadership and culture now?
I've always been a very curious child and student. In fact, I was voted the most confused student in high school, not because I wasn't bright, but because I asked so many questions. And I think I always loved learning. So I think having grown up in I wouldn't say we were emotionally functional family. I was told that emotional expression was kind of the enemy and kids should be seen and not heard. But I knew that there was a better way. Like I didn't like my situation and I wanted to change it. And I've always been someone that if they didn't like something, didn't just get stuck in the muck and just agonize about it. I wanted to do something about it. And I think that's why I've been so passionate about learning and growing. I've done so much self-development work my entire life, not only professionally, but personally. And so I think my passion for learning and then being a teacher at all those levels, like I'm trained in elementary, I'm trained in high school, I taught in high school, and then I've taught post-secondary for all these years. My whole mission is about learning more, being better, and then teaching others. And that's what I'm really passionate about doing.
Yeah, I'd say that speaks more to the question about, your personality and your temperament. But what I'm talking about is the groups that surrounded you. So when you're growing up, you're surrounded by English-speaking people. You're surrounded by a city culture. It's going to be different. It's going to affect you differently than it would be if you were in a rural area.
Well, I was the only Caucasian girl in my class. It was mostly Asian students. I grew up wanting to be Japanese because all my friends were Japanese. And my mother was convinced I was going to marry a Japanese man when I grew up. I would buy the comic books that all my friends bought, even though I couldn't read a word of Japanese. And it wasn't until university that I went back and studied Japanese and learned the language. So in terms of the groups that I grew up with, I certainly was different than everyone else. I also was probably one of the few that I can remember. I was a Jewish kid. So I remember hiding the fact that I was Jewish because nobody, obviously when you came back from school, you talked about your Christmas holidays. You never talked about Hanukkah. And so I just always wanted to fit in and be like everyone else and not be different. And not only did I look different, but I also had a different religion at the time.
Mm-hmm. So you had the influence of Jewish culture. And of course, that's not homogenous, right? It varies a lot. And then you would have had the influence of all the Japanese friends around you. Plus your family influence too, right? All of those things would have had something to do with who you became culturally. How do you think those things influenced your culture?
Although I was born Jewish, I really don't know much about my religion. So I don't know how it has impacted me.
Well, it affected you in the sense that you wanted to hide it because you felt it made you different.
Yeah.
And all the things you learned about Japanese culture and from your Japanese friends, how would you say that's affected you?
I think growing up with so many Japanese friends and learning a lot of it later on in life about the language, there's different levels of politeness in Japanese. And I just remember growing up really always saying sumimasen, which means sorry. And I think today still at times apologizing. It's a Canadian thing as well, right?
It is.
We're very polite up here.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, it goes back to my temperament and personality. I'm a very sensitive child, a very anxious child. So I think those all impacted me. Who I am is how I lead.
Mm-hmm. Totally. So then you grew up and you chose to belong to some different groups. And one that you mentioned was the teaching profession. Then being a teacher is a culture as well. And working in the academy is another culture. And then there would have been other ones too. There must have been pastimes that you had and things that you learned to do, people that you met. So then what groups as you were growing up influenced your sense of self and culture, leadership?
I definitely think as a leader, we are all teachers. And the problem that I see in the work that I do, Marie, is that many leaders forget that they're teachers. And as teachers, we know the answers to our students' tests, for instance, but we don't give them the answers or else they're not learning. And I think in the workplace, I think leaders tend to, when an employee comes in with a question, they tend to fly in with their problem-solving hero cape and try to save the day. But in actuality, that's the worst thing they can do, especially on an emotional intelligence front, because the younger generation, if we're talking about Gen Zs, are lower at problem solving, lower at stress tolerance, and lower at independence than any generation before them. So the worst thing we can do is give these young people the answers, because then they become culturally dependent, just like I was very dependent on my mother. Mm-hmm. So I think in the workplace, you need to ask questions, coach, kind of what we were talking about off air, learn to be a good coach and not give them the answers. You might have the answers, but not give them the answers. The answers are also coming from your perspectives. So who are you to say that is the answer. So I would say my teaching profession really has helped my leadership style, because I like to create structure and guidelines to let people know what a good job looks like and how to measure success, and how, I try to assign a task very clearly. But then I like to connect with my students, employees, clients, and believe in them and empower them to do the same. And then I like getting out of the way and letting them show me what they can do. And I think really that secret sauce has led to my leadership success.
Yeah, that's a lovely secret sauce, because you're there as people need it in the beginning. You ask them questions so they apply it in their own way and find their own understanding. And then you rejoice in their success. And let them carry out what they've learned to do, which is really, if every person in a management position learned to do those things, we'd be laughing all the time.
Well, and I think they forget, right? But we can't fault them for that, because again, when I think back to my education days, I don't know if I really learned those skills learning the theory about education, or, I can certainly cite you some pedagogy, but I think the issue is really paying attention to what's going on in the room. Teaching with empathy, using your eyes to listen just as much as your ears. And what is the room telling you? Are they losing focus? Are they engaged? Are you calling on the same students? Are the same student, are you calling people by their names? It's all of these facilitation techniques that can help a leader, whether you're teaching a class or leading a team or leading a meeting. It's all the same kinds of principles, but I'm even thinking back to all my years in education. I don't know if actually anyone really broke it down into that level of teaching, right? In that kinesthetic level. And I think that the issue is, you're thrown into these leadership positions without doing any drills first. Just like in all sports, you do drills to get good at your sports. So when you're under pressure, and the time is on, your muscle memory will kick in. Well, the unfortunate thing with leadership is we're thrown in the arena, and, we have to have difficult conversations, yet we don't know how to have them. We need to give performance reviews. We don't know how to have them. We need to give some positive, but also some constructive feedback. We don't know how to have those conversations. We don't know how to deal with conflict. So if we can practice those things in the classroom before we throw them in the arena, I think that would do wonders for that.
I totally agree with you on that. So let's go back to your personality, which you were describing earlier. So there are things that you mentioned, sensitivity as a child being one, and then a thirst for learning would have been the things that you had already. You might have had a few more things that people would say, oh yeah, that's Carolyn. She was like that since she was little. That would be your temperament. And then the personality is what you grow through overcoming or not overcoming obstacles that are in your path, and finding and taking on opportunities for growth. So what would you say is your temperament, and what would you say you've added on to your personality?
Well, I think my temperament, as you've said, I was a sensitive child, so always keeping people's feelings in mind. I was an anxious child, so I was very worried about the future. I was an intense child, right? I needed a lot of certainty, and, I went big or I went home. I was a persistent child. I never gave up. And I think of myself, I was easily distracted in terms of temperament, which now is why I surround myself with people who can keep me focused, because I think I kind of have a mind of a mind map. Personality, I think I'm pretty influential. I'm an extrovert. I like to connect with lots of people, and I get a lot of energy from people. I think I'm an intuitive thinker. I go with my gut. I definitely need closure. I hate leaving things open-ended. I like to know, and that kind of goes back to the certainty of things. I'm pretty open about my emotions. I think I'm dependable. I have a good attention to detail. Those are things about my personality. And as I said, right, who I am is how I lead. Those things show up in my leadership, for sure.
Mm-hmm. It's the only way you can lead. You can't lead from who you are not.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I don't think I've ever had any guest on the podcast have such a concise and clear list of self-aware characteristics that where they could differentiate temperament and personality like you just did.
Well, I think, like I said, it goes back to all my work and years in personal development, right? I think you really need to, and that's what my whole book's about. It's the subtitle's called An Inside Out Journey to Transformational Leadership. I absolutely think you need to take a good, hard, honest look in the mirror and see, what is helping and hurting you as a person in your life, but also you as a leader in your job. And it wasn't until I realized, wow, I really lack independence and that gets in my way, or I'm overly flexible and I over accommodate, that I realized what I needed to tweak in my leadership. So sometimes I need to be a bit more stringent. Sometimes I need to care less about what people think. And as you know, Marie, you being a first-time author or an author as well, I don't know if it's first time, but a new author as well, it's scary to put your ideas out there for the world to judge.
It is.
But I was brave and afraid at the same time. And that's my whole point. And I think that's what I've been my whole life. I've been very brave. And although I've been afraid, I've been very brave to do the hard work.
You can feel the fear and do it anyway.
Exactly.
Right.
Great book by Susan Jeffers.
Isn't it? Can you recall a time when you became aware that your understanding of the world was just specific to you? A moment of cognitive dissonance or cultural dissonance where you just went, whoa, I thought this was the way the whole world works, but it isn't, obviously.
I think my anxiety really stems from being either lied to or information kept from me. And again, I didn't know until I was, diagnosed with generalized anxiety that I was like, oh, this isn't what everyone feels. I never knew, what was happening, or I felt something like, when's the rug going to be pulled out from underneath me? And I still feel that way to this day. And I work really hard. And that's why I think I've worked really hard at managing my emotions, because my emotions from all that fear took over. And it was me trying to not let my fear run my life. And so coming up with learning the mental skills and the cognitive strategies to be stronger and smarter than those feelings at times, even though they're incredibly personal and painful, really has helped me kind of calm my anxiety.
That's great. I'm thinking about when you go to another place as well. So this is a more sort of the sense of dissonance, or you mentioned abandonment and anxiety from your own reaction to your existing circumstances. But I'm sure when you moved to another city or when you went to study in Copenhagen, that you would have also experienced some things that made you think, wow, not everybody is doing things this way.
I don't know if I would say that that's true with geography.
I'm not really talking about that. I'm more talking about a social context where you learn something different. So like you said, from your Japanese friends, the whole piece of politeness and how important it is to be polite and the different levels of politeness. I also lived in Japan for a time, and I found the politeness and the bowing really lovely. Actually, I missed it when I came back to North America. I was thinking everybody should bow. This is just such a nice, reverent way to greet other people. But at first, it was confusing to me. When I went to India, I found everybody rushing up, 5 or 6 people rushing up to grab my suitcase or take my coat, and somebody else to give me a flower wreath and someone else to give me a cool drink or something all at once. Really overwhelming. And I wasn't used to that many people doing such specific tasks around me all the time, and that I didn't know what my response was supposed to be. So that was a big shock to me. I thought, oh, I'm used to like doing things on my own, holding my own suitcase, doing my own thing, asking questions and getting answers. I'm not used to all these people coming to me and saying, I'm doing this for you, and I'm just supposed to know what to do. So that was a big shock. So I'm wondering if you had any experiences like that.
Yeah, if I go back to the Japanese culture experiences, the way when you give them your business card and the way that they take it with 2 hands and they look at it and they don't just shove it in their pocket, and like they really give you the respect or give that extension of you with your business card, the attention. I think that was something that I noticed culturally was different than what I had grown up with in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
Although having said that, I grew up with such a big population of the Japanese culture. Like I did know that culture existed or those behaviors existed, whether you were in Japan or in Canada. On the other hand, a big shock when I went to Japan the first time when I was 18 years old was I thought all Japanese people were going to be kind and polite until I got on the subway and was sandwiched, sardined into the subway and felt very violated. So that was a big eye opener that although kind people are my kind of people, not everyone is kind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's often the case, especially when you live in Canada. There aren't a lot of divides between cultures and social classes and races like there would be, say, in the United States. And so you are constantly bumping up against people from a variety of different places. But when they become your friends, you think everybody from that group is like that, unless you meet a wide enough swath of humanity from that part of the world to realize that there's a whole lot of divergence.
that was a big lesson at 17, 18 when I went there. I did have a bit of a culture shock that, oh, I can't just trust and know that everyone's got my back and is kind here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Part of learning street smarts as a teenager too, right?
Yeah. And I think as a kid, I was kind of, again, sheltered and from my mother. So I didn't kind of learn those street smarts. I always say that I'm definitely more book smart than street smart.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of degrees, but that doesn't necessarily, the fact that you've been traveling and, did all of that. I think my traveling days, which is why I am so grateful to my mother, is she worked, as a single parent, she worked 3 jobs to give me an education so I could travel the world and go to school in Denmark and do all these study abroad programs so that I could have the best education. And I think those are that's where you learn those street smarts that we're talking about, which is the reason why, quite frankly, I teach soft skills in school, because anyone nowadays can watch a YouTube video, read something on Google. I mean, now with AI, my goodness, these robots can now write these students' papers, but what they can't do is teach them how to interact with others in good times and in bad. And I think only with practice do you get that, and confidence comes only with competence. So if we teach young people the social and emotional skills necessary to thrive in the future of work, I think that's going to be the answer. But we need absolutely to have repetition, practice, feedback, all the adult principles of learning to keep the learning to stick.
Exactly. Well, we're getting close to the end of the interview. And so if you're in the position of, being hired by a client and they potentially could ask you this question, what brings out the best in you, Carolyn? What would allow us to work together in a way that where you would be most comfortable and most able to show your true colors? What would you say?
I think learning to be in the driver's seat of your feelings and understanding how to lead. And leadership is leading with a strong mind and a kind heart. I was just on TV this morning talking about Jacinda Ardern's speech when she was leaving Parliament, and talking about that you can be emotional and strong, right? They're not mutually exclusive. So I think learning to lead with a strong mind and a kind heart while using a set of clear, simple, tested skills and strategies. And to me, when you do that, you connect more authentically, you communicate more effectively, and you thrive more collectively. And that kind of connection and communication will create an environment of trust and belonging that'll spur engagement, spike curiosity, and engender fraternity among team members. And to me, that's what leading with emotional intelligence is all about.
If the other people on the team can lead with a clear mind and a strong heart, is that what you said?
Strong mind and a kind heart.
A strong mind and a kind heart. Good thing I checked with you. So a strong mind and a kind heart, that would bring out the best in you too.
I think really leading with emotional intelligence is all about using, being smarter than those darn little emotions that can get the best of us. That doesn't mean strong arming your feeling or having a steely resolve not to feel. It just simply means that we acknowledge that we feel things, that we understand where those feelings are coming from, what triggered those feelings, that we label them appropriately, that we express them respectfully and professionally, and that we regulate them and manage them appropriately. And I think once we do that, then the world will just connect more authentically and communicate more effectively. And like I said, and thrive more collectively.
Right. So here's your soapbox moment. What would you like to promote?
If I could tell every leader who's struggling to get the results they need with one thing, it would be, don't be afraid of your emotions, yours or your team's. And I would tell them to all check out my new book, The Emotionally Strong Leader. And I'm just happy to report I just won one of the best business books from Axiom Awards, a bronze medal in the leadership category. So I'm really proud of that achievement. So yeah, go check out my book at carolynstern.com or eiexperience.com/book. And you can find me there or check out my social media tags and handles.
That's great. Congratulations on winning that distinction.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And thanks so much for having me.
Is there anything else you'd like to say?
Just remember, you can be emotional and strong. They're not mutually exclusive.
That's a great way to end. Thanks, Carolyn.
Thanks, Marie, for having me.
Carolyn Stern is an emotional intelligence expert who has walked the path of self-awareness and self-development from a tender age and is certainly articulate about her inner discoveries. Her book, The Emotionally Strong Leader, An Inside-Out Journey to Transformational Leadership, teaches emotional intelligence through the metaphor of a strong mind and a kind heart. I enjoyed listening to Carolyn's explanation of her own journey to uncover barriers to growth, set goals, and tap into internal motivation. And I'm looking forward to reading a copy of her book to celebrate her interview. You can help us celebrate too by rating and reviewing the podcast or by buying me a coffee using the links on the shiftworkplace.com/podcast page, where you will also find the show notes and links for Carolyn Stern's episode. Thank you for listening, and may culture and leadership connections continue to guide and inspire your day. Want to show some appreciation? You can buy me a coffee. What? How do you buy a coffee for a podcast owner? Well, there's a way. Let me explain. You go to buymeacoffee.com/Marie Gervais. That's spelled MarieGervais. So it's buymeacoffee.com/Marie Gervais. And when you go to that website, what's going to happen is you'll get a chance to click on 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 cups of coffee at $5 a piece to help contribute to the cost of the podcast. And yes, it's $5 for a cup of coffee because it's quality coffee for a quality podcast. So I hope you will contribute and you'll help us to reduce the costs of the podcast by going to buymeacoffee.com/Marie Gervais. Thank you in advance for your generous contribution.